Here's a question that I struggle with. How do you decide which class to main? Most of my friends simply pick one class when they first start out and then stick to it forever. But for myself, I have a slightly different approach. I like to go through a months-long endeavor, rerolling to and from half the classes in the game, manually level up and try PvPing on each of them, and then finally go back and stick to the very first class I picked when starting out. Okay, maybe this whole process might sound like a meme, but I really did reroll 8 times, and I actually learned a lot by the end of it. And if you're interested in what ended up happening, then keep listening, and I'll tell you all about it. So when I first decided to play Deathblade, it wasn't because I read some guides or tier list explaining which classes are broken and which classes are not. My choice of Deathblade is simply because I've always enjoyed playing assassin-type classes. My playstyle suits well with that of an agile damage dealer, and this has always been the case for me in my 10 years of MMO experience, from Perfect Road International to Black Desert Online. And now naturally, I had thought that it would be the same playing Lost Ark. That was really all it took for me to pick Assassin as my first class, and I chose Deathblade over Shadowhunter simply by playing with the two classes for around an hour each in the closed beta, and deciding that Deathblade just felt more natural to me. And so that was settled. On February 9th, 2022, I started playing Deathblade in PvP for the very first time. But of course, the people I PvP'd with had other plans in mind. With Lost Ark being a team-based 3v3 and all, it was quickly pointed out to me by both allies and foes that I was absolutely trash at Deathblade. And I mean, they were right of course. After all, I only played Deathblade for less than a day. But I can't help but wonder, is it not expected that players play bad when the game newly launches? Is Deathblade such an obviously strong class that my performance would be considered so abysmal even for a day 1 player that I should be called out? Should I really have been performing way better, even despite my complete lack of knowledge of the game? Well, a quick look at some tier lists all but confirmed my worst fears. It turns out that Deathblade was considered an S tier class, the tier that's reserved for classes which are either patently broken, impossible to counterplay, or are simply and undeniably one of the best. And yet, in my hands, it was not. But why is that? Many reasons comes to mind. However, there was one very real possibility that I am forced to consider. That maybe Deathblade simply wasn't the class for me. That maybe it didn't fit with my playstyle, or match my expectation of what the class is supposed to be. And the only way to prove that theory, either true or false, is to try playing every other class first. Soulfist was the first class I rerolled to. To me, Soulfist always felt kind of like a hybrid class, one that can CC and DPS at both melee and range. And those ranged abilities is what I was really counting on when I picked this class. The thing is, melee classes have never really been beginner friendly in every MMO I've played on. I mean sure, in a straight up 1v1 it's anyone's game. But when you consider every other scenario, whether it's small scale, large scale, GVG, any type of team fights really, there's a higher skill floor to playing melee than what is required to play as range. As a melee, you need the map awareness to know when you can safely go in. You need the game knowledge to avoid getting peeled off by their teammates, and you need the positional understanding to know when to pull back and not overextend. It's not enough to just know how to handle the one person you're targeting. You have to account for everything else their teammates can do as well. But for the ranged classes, they often don't have the same burden as melees do, so long as they're able to stick with their team. Their own allies will act as cover, allowing them to CC and DPS without putting themselves at risk, and should they ever get caught, it's way easier for their teammates to peel for a ranged class who's right next to them, rather than a melee class who's deep within enemy lines. With ranged classes, a beginner could focus entirely on moving with and assisting their teammates, without having to worry about everything else that comes with being a melee. That is why whenever I try to learn PvP on a new MMO, one of my strategies is to begin by playing a ranged ult first. And as a Lost Ark beginner myself, who is getting outplayed at every corner on melee right now, switching to Soulfist seemed like a good place to start. I wanted to familiarize myself with Lost Ark's basic gameplay, mechanics, and strategies first, without all the positional knowledge of melee classes getting in the way. However, there was really one major downside with my choice of Soulfist. It's not actually a ranged class. It has elements of ranged classes, sure, but I would be missing out on half my kit if I tried to play it as a pure ranged character. And that's a problem for me, Because I didn't eliminate the skill floor of playing a melee class, I just added the skill floor of playing a ranged class on top of it. So not only will I have to worry about getting PO'd and focused with melee skills, but now I also have to worry about the slower casting time of ranged skills as well. And to make matters worse, Lost Ark is really stingy with which skills get any type of protections at all. To get full protection against CCs in this game, I learned that I would need both push immunities in combination with debuff immunity. Push immunity is what protects me against skills that launches me into the air or knocks me to the ground, while debuff immunity is what actually protects me against stuns. And to get this combination of immunities together in a single skill is something so powerful that it's reserved only for the class's ultimates. Most skills either grant no protections period, or merely grants paralysis immunity, which protects against only the built-in hit stun that every attack has by default. So this is tripping me up quite a bit, because I'm still used to the BDO playstyle where every skill has full CC immunities. But now on Lost Ark, I'm simply getting CC'd before my attacks even come out. And trying to play Soulfist, where I have to position myself to both be able to use melee attacks and ranged attacks, have been way harder for me than just focusing on melee or ranged alone. Soulfist is not the class I want to be playing right now. Sorceress was the next class I tried. After all, if my main issue with Soulfist was that it was a hybrid, then a pure ranged class like Sorceress is the logical next step, right? Now, you would think that for someone who mains fast, melee, assassin-style classes, that Sorceress is going to be the last thing I want to play. And yet, it turns out, Sorceress was somehow the most intuitive class for me on Lost Ark, out of all the classes I've tried. I don't know if it was because of the similarities between Sorceress and other MMOs I've played, or if it was because Sorceress is actually the class that I really should have been playing. But I didn't really feel any disconnect between how I expected this class to be versus how it actually plays, like how what happened with Soulfist. If anything, the real disconnect was between how CCs worked in PvE and how they really worked in PvP. One of the very first things I've noticed about Lost Ark is that I could use my dash button to stand up if I were laying on the ground. Sometimes, I could even use my dash while I'm in hit stun, or paralysis as the game calls it. But what confused me was whether or not there was anything that can be done when it comes to just regular stuns. I mean, yeah, I knew that a bar appeared over your head after the stun wears off, indicating that you can't be stunned again for a short while. But if I wanted to break out of a stun anytime I wanted to, was that possible? And it was at this moment that a friend of mine stepped in, and for whatever reason, they answered, yes, they could break out of a stun. And unfortunately, this is why I had incorrectly thought that Lost Ark had a CC break. There was another MMO I used to play in the past called Swordsman Online that had a CC system which was incredibly similar to Lost Ark. One of the major skill cap of Swordsman Online was a mind game revolving around when you choose to stand up after getting CC'd, or if you decided to stand up at all. And should your opponent correctly predict your stand up, or lack thereof, they could immediately follow up with a second CC and begin their combo. Anything else, and you could simply break out mid-combo, taking minimal damage. And that's how I had thought that the CC system worked on Lost Ark as well, that my game plan would revolve around chasing someone down to CC them 2 times back to back. But after playing Sorceress, I now know that this couldn't be further from the truth. Where Deathblade had a single stun that I never used, Sorceress had Electrocution from Squall, Freeze from Ice Shower, and the multi-hit paralysis from Lightning Vortex. And it didn't take long for me to confirm that no, none of my opponents are breaking out from any of those CCs. Because if they could, then they wouldn't have been standing there taking full damage as I cast all of my hardest hitting skills. So regrettably, my friend was wrong about being able to break out of stuns. And what I had thought was an ability to dash out of paralysis was really a result of reaching some sort of CC cap. Truly, it was completely unnecessary for me to insist on following up with 2 CCs back to back. What I really should have been focusing on is trying to land stuns instead. At this point, I was honestly really close to just making the call and rerolling to Sorceress right there and then. After all, I did mention that the class felt very intuitive to play, plus I figured out a good amount of mechanics on her already. But sadly, there was one minor but important detail about Lost Ark's arena. The ranked game mode is 3v3 with random teammates. The problem that I have with Sorceress is that while she seems really strong with a team that has good synergy, she also feels useless if put on a team that refuses to work together. With her lack of push immunity and long cast time for skills, it's hard for her to contribute DPS if there's no effort made by the team to work with and support her. And when playing with random teammates, I feel that these type of teams are pretty much unavoidable, for that is just the nature of random matchmaking. And so, if I were to play ranked arena long term, I want to avoid putting myself into these type of scenarios that could be a source of tilt, frustration, and resentment. What I need is a class where I can take initiative and hold my own, regardless of the efficacy of the team that I'm put in. So naturally, another friend of mine convinced me to try Gunslinger. To be honest, this wasn't really on my list of classes to reroll to initially. I mean, sure, it has more push immunity than Sorceress, but then I'm back to the same problem as Soulfist with her mix of long-range sniper skills and short-range shotgun skills. However, my friend assured me that it won't be a problem, that most of her kit is actually melee, that the ranged attacks are just for pokes, and she's really more of an assassin than anything else. And so I thought, why not? I mean, her identity revolves around weapon switching, and that's something that I do every day on BDO after all. How hard could it be? Well, it's pretty hard apparently. Right away, I got stuck on just the skill selection phase itself. It turns out I kind of fundamentally misunderstood how Gunslinger skills were supposed to work. Pretty much every class I tried so far had the common theme when it comes to their skill builds. They get to choose exactly 8 skills and 1 ultimate, where they either have 6 skills at level 10 and 2 at level 7, or 7 skills at level 10 and 1 at level 4. Gunslinger was a huge exception to all of that. They have the same amount of skill points as everyone else, and yet they must distribute those 340 skill points across 16 skills, not just 8. So while it was fairly intuitive to me what most of the skills I should select for Soulfist and Sorceress are, I had no idea where to even begin when it comes to Gunslinger. And so, this was the first time since I started playing Lost Ark, where I felt that I had no way to move forwards without searching up a guide. However, as it would turn out, I ended up learning about more than just Gunslinger skills from the guide. Apparently, I had actually been statting all of my characters wrong this entire time. Up until now, my stat distribution has always been 750 swiftness, 250 crit. I knew that it would be important to max out my attack speed, movement speed, and cooldown reduction, and that the remaining stat points would go into damage. But where I was mistaken was in thinking that crit was the optimal damage stat. I mean, it made sense at the time. Critical hits dealt double damage, so increasing my chances of critting is basically the same as increasing my total damage. The problem, however, was that I had no idea how to check exactly what crit rate those 250 stat points are actually getting me. Only now did I realize that I could actually open up my character profile while inside the arena or in Trixion, revealing that 250 crit only amounted to 8.94% chance of landing a crit. Meanwhile, 250 domination was a flat 15.33% damage increase to pushed or debuffed foes. With how often people get CC'd in this game, domination might as well have been a permanent damage increase. So really, I should have been statting domination this whole time. And that was just the start of my problems. Even after testing what my skills do, confirming what my combos are, and reviewing my general strategies, the class honestly just does not feel intuitive to play. I mean, I know that in theory, all 3 of her weapons should be working together, creating a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. And yet, despite my best efforts, I simply cannot see Gunslinger this way. Try as I may, I would constantly get fixated on using up all of the cooldowns for a single weapon before switching to a different one, playing her as if she was either a pure melee or pure range class, but never that union of both that she's meant to be. And I rely a lot on intuition and muscle memory with the way I PvP. So if Gunslinger is not intuitive to me, then I simply cannot play Gunslinger. I'm sure the class itself has a lot of potential, but I guess this just wasn't meant for me. Shadowhunter was an interesting one. If I hadn't known any better, I would have thought that she was this so-called ranged assassin class that my friend has been referring to, and not Gunslinger. With her ability to pressure with constant chip damage and movement debuff, poke the enemy and peel for allies with ranged CCs, and jump into the fray with instant gap closers at the perfect moment, it really makes me question why this wasn't the second class I tried after Deathblade, instead of going the long route with Soulfist into Sorceress into Gunslinger. But I guess that's just what happens when the level 1 class tester misrepresents a class. Then again, if I had played Shadowhunter first, I might have missed out on all the lessons I learned from those other classes. And who knows, maybe I would have circled back to them eventually and ended up playing all 8 classes anyways, just in a different order. One thing is for sure though, my experience with Shadowhunter was the turning point for me, though not exactly thanks to the class itself. See, one of the benefits of playing classes other than your main is not only to better learn what they can do, but also to better learn what your own class can do by proxy. If you ever get a chance to fight against someone else playing your own class, you get a chance to see how they deal with certain tactics and strategies in ways that you might not have thought about yourself. When the grass seems greener on the other side, playing another class against your own main can quickly prove that thought either right or wrong. And that's exactly what happened to me. By the time I was playing Shadowhunter, I had gradually gained enough experience for playing all these other classes that I was starting to have an idea of what's going on with the game and what to look out for in a fight. I mean, I'm not saying that I was good, but I was certainly less useless than when I was on Deathblade. At least I understood how protections worked. At least I stopped whiffing all my DPS. At least I could start going melee without instantly dying. And at least I knew the difference between stuns and push. Or at least, so I thought. There was an acquaintance of mine, friend of a friend, who had quite a bit of experience in both BDO as well as Lost Ark. He described the CC system on Lost Ark as being very similar to that of BDO. And up until now, I was inclined to agree with him. If you take the stand-up mechanic away, then everything else can pretty much just be thought of as BDO, but with a much larger CC cap. And so I was in absolute shock when I came across the fact that you can actually stun someone while they're still mid-air after being pushed, and that in doing so, denies them the ability to use their stand-up skill. And I could have never imagined that this was an actual mechanic, because not only does it go against one of the main rules of BDO, that you can't stun someone who's being launched into the air or knocked to the ground, but it's also the first action-based MMO I've played where you can stack CCs like this for additional effects, as opposed to just having them overwrite each other. So what this means is that Deathblade is actually even stronger than what I had thought after my experience with Sorceress earlier. I don't even have to land my stun as my opening CC. On the contrary, pretty much any CC I land can subsequently be converted into a stun. Now, I'm not telling this story to fault anyone just because I don't know the mechanics. I doubt I would have figured this out myself whether I had BDO in mind or not. But having now discovered this information, I've basically unlocked entirely new combos and mix-ups for my Deathblade that I previously had not thought was even possible. For a while, it was almost starting to seem like Shadowhunter was the way to go. I had thought that melee classes were too linear and predictable in Lost Ark, and that I could output damage much more consistently by playing classes with some form of range skills. But with my newfound insight on how powerful stuns really are, I realize it is clear now that there was much I had been mistaken about. And while I did enjoy playing Shadowhunter in and of itself, when compared to other classes, I would still ultimately prefer to main someone that focused more on landing full combos, as opposed to Shadowhunter's chip and poke damage playstyle. And while she had seemed appealing at first, the problem was that I had completely misappreciated the type of combos that melee classes actually had to offer. So I had felt that it was time for me to look at some other melee classes again, through new lenses. My choice to play Wardancer stems much more from pure curiosity rather than anything else. From my perspective, it felt as if there was a large overlap between the roles of the assassin classes and that of the martial arts classes. I mentioned earlier that Shadowhunter felt similar to Gunslinger for me, but if anything, Shadowhunter feels even more similar to Soulfist than it did with Gunslinger. Think about it. They're both hybrid classes. They both have brain skills that can let them peel, do chip damage, or poke the enemy. They both have fast gap closer skills that let them quickly get into melee range and do some combos. They even both have identity skills based on getting a power boost through transformation, with clear similarities between Soulfist's Hype Mode and Dragon Ball Z's Super Saiyan forms. And if there were such similarities between Soulfist and Shadowhunter, then what of that between Wardancer and Deathblade? What if Wardancer is actually the assassin type class I've been looking for, and not Deathblade? Initially, I had thought of martial artists as this brawler type class, one who is able to stay in the front lines and sustain fighting for a long period of time through the use of push immunities and innate tankiness. And this would differ from a typical assassin, who would be more so specialized in focusing down and killing single targets while employing a hit and run playstyle in group PvP situations. But yet, the more I play Wardancer, the more I feel that I had gotten it completely backwards. I mean, yeah, Wardancer got the tanky part right with her defense buffs and high base stats, but I'm not so sure about that push immunity part anymore. For better or for worse, Wardancer seems to have less push immunities than Deathblade, whether it's on gap closers, CCs, or DPS. And unlike the other classes I've played so far, Wardancer doesn't have any range skills to make up for it. So I'm really struggling to see here how Wardancer isn't actually just another assassin. The biggest difference that I've personally noticed seems to be in their gap closing abilities. While Deathblade is the one with the protected gap closer, you really only get one shot to catch your target. Deathblade seems to really fall short if she needs to chase someone down on long distance marathons. Meanwhile, Wardancer seems to stick to a target, chase them down over and over again, and it's incredibly hard to actually get rid of for good. Now, I've always considered myself an aggressive player, sometimes to a fault. So I would have thought that theoretically, Wardancer would be the class that allows me to better take initiative, to proactively engage the enemy, to be the one making the aggressive plays. But with their lack of push immunities, I find myself having to be very careful with choosing my positions and engagements, just like with Deathblade, but without any of Deathblade's protections. So if anything, Wardancer is more of an assassin than the actual assassin class, and Deathblade is a better brawler than the martial arts class. But even though I do enjoy the assassin playstyle, it doesn't feel like Wardancer is necessarily the right way to go either. See, even though I've always played assassin in past MMOs, the way I've played them is much more reminiscent of a frontline brawler. I would heavily make use of skills that focused on combat, evasion, and damage mitigation, but I would rarely touch the parts of my kit that emphasize any sort of stealth-oriented plays. And so, being able to get to the front line and stay on the front line through push immunities is actually much more in line with what I'm looking for in a class compared to Wardancer, where I would need to constantly disengage after every single attack. On top of that, I feel like there's a lot more to this class that I'm just not grasping, which is kind of the same problem I had with Gunslinger. Because intuitively, I still want to play Wardancer like a brawler, even though I already know that in practice, I would simply end up inting my games. So I figured it's probably best that I avoid playing Wardancer for now. So why not Berserker then? I mean, just from the name alone, a Berserker sounds like it should be the prime candidate for fulfilling a role of an aggressive frontline class. And unlike Wardancers, Berserkers actually have all the push immunities that Wardancers lack. Every time I've lost to a Berserker on the enemy's team, there was a good chance that I get someone on my team complaining that I wasn't doing enough to PO the enemy Berserker. And yet, I could never figure out what I ought to actually do against their seemingly infinite chain of CC immunities. I mean, yeah, I know that you can stun someone in push immunity, but it's not uncommon for it to be already on cooldown by the time they ask for a PO. And even if it was available, it doesn't mean I'll always land it if they see me coming and dash out of the way. So, what else do I do instead? One way would be to play the class myself so that I learn which skills have push immunities and which ones don't. But another way is for me to realize that I'm not in BDO anymore, and that there's actual visual indication for once that tells me whether a skill has push immunity or not. But it took me a while to actually notice it, because in my defense, there was a bit of inconsistency with how the visual is displayed. Now, as far as I can tell, when someone is using a push immunity skill in the arena, they get surrounded by a yellow glow to indicate such. But what's confusing is when that exact same skill with the exact same add-ons is used in the open world, the player glows white instead of yellow. And that exact same white glow is also used to indicate paralysis immunity skills when inside the arena. And that's not even to mention how confusing it is that the dash and stand-up mechanics also gives a yellow glow, and yet there's nothing to indicate the fact that they also give debuff immunity. Or how bars can also give a buff that grants debuff immunity, which is also indicated by a whitish glow. So you can see how it might have been slightly confusing the first few times I've seen it. But even though I know how to identify protections now, that doesn't mean my experience with Berserker was all for naught. At the very least, I feel that I've gotten better at dodging and CCing Berserkers as a result of playing the class. After all, being able to identify a skill immediately from the animation alone is going to be faster than trying to look out for the color that their character is glowing. And also, I was at least somewhat correct about Berserkers having a bunch of push immunities. I didn't just hallucinate them like I did for Wardancers. Yet, even so, I still ultimately decided against playing Berserker. I am looking for an aggressive class, and while Berserker sounds like it would fit the bill in theory, I feel like it falls slightly short in practice. The thing is, while there's nothing stopping me from just rushing in and casting push immune skills, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'll actually do any damage just by doing so. With how slow and telegraphed Berserker's attacks are, there's no shortage of tactics my opponents can use to avoid them. And this could oftentimes be as simple as just moving around slightly, sometimes by accident even while doing something else. And it's not like I can just try again if I miss either. With how long Berserker skill cooldowns are, more often than not, I'm just waiting on the sidelines until I'm actually able to do something again and help my team. And really, that's just not the type of pacing I'm looking for in an aggressive class. So Berserker is not the class I want to main either. That leaves only Artillerist remaining. The rest of the classes didn't seem all that interesting to me, so I just straight up ruled them out. And I almost did the same for this class too, until I was inspired by an Artillerist friend of mine to try it. See, at first glance, I wouldn't have considered Artillerist to be all that interesting. I mean, he seemed highly immobile, with his identity skill literally turning him into a stationary turret. He seemed really slow, with some of his skills having cast times longer than that of Sorceress and Berserker combined. And he was a range class, even though a melee class is ultimately what's ideal for me. However, there was one major plus that convinced me to give him a try anyway. The claim that he is supposedly the top DPS class in the game. Now, I don't know exactly if that's true, it's just what I heard from other people, but every time I had an Artillerist on my team, more often than not, they would out-DPS me as well as my other teammate. Obviously, me being bad at the game probably has something to do with it, but even so, that Artillerist friend of mine from earlier has won games where he's dealt over 1 million damage, and I've never seen any other class I partied with even come close to such a feat. So at the very least, I was going to give Artillerist a fair shot. Funnily enough though, the biggest complaint that I got while playing Artillerist was not from people saying that I am bad, but from people saying that I was playing an easy class. Well, after playing it myself, I can partly see where they come from. Just partly. If we're talking about just the steps needed to combo someone, then yeah, it's probably the most straightforward out of all the classes I played so far. You got a ranged multi-hit paralysis opener, which has a guaranteed chain into a stun, which you can then get a guaranteed chain to your nukes for nearly half of someone's HP. Every other class has some sort of timing, aiming, or positioning gimmick to them, while also doing far less damage. But on Artillerist, I can press my buttons in order, and it just works. However, that's about as far as it goes when it comes to being an easy class, because it's really only a small part of being an Artillerist. If I want to combo someone, I have to be able to catch them first. And that alone can already go wrong in so many ways. First, there's the problem of getting peeled. Despite being a range class, the most important CC of the combo, the stun, is a melee attack. And you would think that this wouldn't be a problem because of the class's self-shield skill, but it turns out that the shield is really nothing more than just a temporary HP bar. It may help me tank damage, but it doesn't really do anything for me when it comes to actually avoiding CCs. And while there is an add-on that grants push immunity for the duration of the shield, I'm still vulnerable to stuns with my shield up all the same. So to be able to combo someone, I have to catch them out of position first, much like a melee class. But how do I catch them out of position anyway? That's my second problem. Half of my skills can't even hit anything that moves, but it's not like my opponents are going to stop moving on their own if I don't go and do something about it. So do I try and throw down my nukes and hope they walk into it? Do I slowly chase them down with the flamethrower? Do I try to position myself with the minigun and get them that way? But even if I do get everything right and catch someone without anyone peeling me, they sometimes still manage to get away. The thing is, the Artillerist stun is pretty much the exact duration it takes for the nukes to land. In fact, it's so long that it can actually be shortened by other CCs. If one of my teammates rushes to use their CC on my target either before or even right after I land my stun, it can actually allow the target to stand up and dash away before my nukes land, negating my damage entirely. And so, I think Artillerist just isn't going to be the class for me. I'm already not a huge fan of the very slow, methodical, zoning heavy style of gameplay. But when it becomes possible for my own allies to interfere with me, that's just a bit too much. So in the end, Artillerist was not the top DPS class for me. And so, with everything that's happened, and all the experience I gained, I am ultimately brought back to Deathblade. I wanted an aggressive brawler class with assassin style gameplay, and it seems like Deathblade was the class that I've been looking for all along. I was simply lacking the knowledge needed to make the class work, and it took me 8 rerolls to learn them. So finally, using my newfound knowledge, I managed to do a complete overhaul of my Deathblade skill build since the first impressions video. Maybe it's time for me to get ranked to try now, but that will have to wait until next time.